Is a picture worth 1,000 words? According to Michael Legere, Executive Director of Forest New Brunswick, which appears to be an organization very similar to Forest Nova Scotia, essentially a propaganda wing of the forestry cartel, a picture is not worth 1,000 words. You see, Mike recently wrote this, shall we call it an editorial, called A Picture is Not Worth 1,000 Words, which was posted to the Forest New Brunswick website on December 2nd, 2020. And it was, interestingly enough, a response by Michael Legere in regard to a video I had made entitled The New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse, which was posted to YouTube back on October 30th, 2020. In that video, I used the Microsoft Flight Simulator to take a virtual flight from Miramichi to Fredericton. Now, I use flight simulators all the time, as I am a certified drone pilot, and I use them to practice flying between actual work. But the Microsoft Flight Simulator is new, and it is something special, because previous flight simulators used mere representations of the Earth. Some, like the Digital Combat System, bases its representations on very accurate terrain data, and applies something like digital painting to render the terrain very realistically. But the Microsoft Flight Simulator goes further. It models its terrain based on actual satellite photography, and through a process called photogrammetry renders that terrain in a three-dimensional perspective so that pilots can practice flying over it as accurately as possible. Videographers and scientists immediately recognized the prospects for this revolutionary new technology. Videographers could study composition long before they ever got to a locale and even get a sense of how the lighting there might work. Scientists could get more realistic perspective of regions to get an idea what areas might be worth studying. And I recognized that since this flight simulator does draw from actual satellite imagery, one could take virtual flights over remote regions to get a sense of what is actually down there. Now, the flight simulator is not 100% reliable because satellite imagery is not 100% reliable. Sometimes imagery becomes out of date, and the dating of the satellite imagery is something you can see for yourself if you go to Google Earth or Bing Maps and simply look up the imagery date on any region that you're looking at. On Google Earth, this is located at the bottom toward the right. Typically, this information is no more than a few years old. So if a picture is not worth 1,000 words, I have to wonder what Mike Legere thinks of satellite imagery and its worth. For now, I would like to take a moment to read you Mike Legere's article, because, quite honestly, I would love for you to be able to decide for yourself whether you think Legere is being straightforward with you. As I read his article, we're going to retrace the route from Fredericton to Miramichi, but this time using direct satellite imagery. At the bottom right, you will see information about each image, when it was taken, typically between 2015 and 2019, as well as the GPS location of the image. And the images portray satellite imagery as if we were perceiving it from an altitude of roughly 18.5 to 19 kilometers. In each image, you're going to see dark regions, moderately hued regions, and pale regions. The dark is forest. Moderate can be things such as farms, natural open landscapes, and partially regrown clearcuts. And the pale regions are typically clearcuts, or they would reflect freshly plowed farmlands. In all but the last couple images, I will show each image as it is unaltered, and then add highlighting to reflect those areas that are likely to be fresh or older clearcuts. The criteria that I have used to determine if a cleared area might be a clearcut is based on whether the pale area is angular, whether it is connected by forestry access roads, whether it is remote or semi-remote or at least out of the way, as often some attempt is made to conceal clearcuts or at least keep them remote, and whether there is the banding that indicates old or new tree planting. I've added this highlighting to help those persons who don't have experience interpreting satellite imagery. It is tricky. I remember my early days in earth science courses struggling with it. And I will add finally that there are many clear-cut areas that I have not marked over in these images, simply because I had to zoom in to greater detail to discern them. And I want you to know that I interpreted these images very conservatively. If at between 18.5 and 19 kilometers it wasn't bleedingly obvious it was a clear cut, I didn't mark it. In other words, I'm giving the forestry industry in New Brunswick the benefit of the doubt. So let's go ahead and read through Michael Legere's article, A Picture is Not Worth 1,000 Words, and see what facts or lack thereof we may find. Quoting, images are powerful propaganda tools, especially when the story that accompanies those images is used to tell a damning story of forestry practices in New Brunswick. But with the use of any imaging technology, whether it's drone footage or satellite imagery, the information it generates is only as good as the interpretation of it. A case in point of this problem is recent footage compiled as a documentary entitled The New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse. Now, this YouTube clip is actually a simulated flight view of a stretch of forest pieced together using satellite imagery. It's actually pretty representative of what you would expect to see if you flew over this stretch of forest in real life. What is missing is knowledgeable interpretation of the scene below and a misleading picture of New Brunswick forest at the landscape level. There is no doubt that there are stretches of conifer-dominated forest stands managed for even-age composition which are to be found in different stages of development, some recently clear-cut, some young, others mature. It's also what a naturally regenerated forest would look like in response to a natural disturbance like budworm outbreak or forest fire event. You know, I told myself I was just going to read it straight through, but I have to stop here and point out some facts. I don't know where Mike is coming from here. I've traveled and studied wildernesses all over the north, and I remember seeing spruce budworms attacking forests, going back decades. In the forests of British Columbia, one could walk through woodlands destroyed by the budworm for hours and still not see the end of it. And a clear-cut does not look like, nor does it work like, a forest after a wildfire or a budworm infestation. Wildfire leaves a forest ground covered in ash. The ash is fertile and provides much-needed nutrients to seeds that are already in the soil, seeds of herbaceous plants and trees that have been dropped there over many years. And if a fire entirely burns down a forest and one were to visit that land just a year or two later, one would see already the green beginnings of a meadow, lush and verdant, filled with a diversity of meadow plants, and an influx of birds and wildlife coming to take advantage of the new feeding area. Often, though, wildfires do not destroy an entire forest, only some of the trees, usually the smaller trees, especially the conifers as they are filled with pitch. Those certain conifers are well designed to survive wildfires as well. But in terrain touched by those wildfires, when one walks through, one discovers a parkland forest where some of the smaller growth has been removed, opening up space between the trees that allows new undergrowth to develop. Though naturally, with the ground so exposed to sunlight, mature and old forest flora that cannot tolerate heavy sunlight vanishes, along with especially sensitive fauna. And in the case of a conifer wood that's been hit by spruce budworm, I've walked through miles and square miles of them. They aren't pretty, but they also do not leave the land an impossible to navigate wreckage of torn stumps and branches, like a clear cut. And they too may yield something like a parkland. The forest parts, sunlight reaches the ground, and there is herbaceous growth without a wrecked landscape. There are many other painfully obvious errors in Mike's comparison of a clear cut to a forest fire as well, far too many to detail in this short video. But one that I think is especially relevant is that both forest fires and clear cuts open up the landscape, exposing watercourses such as streams, small rivers and brooks, vernal and permanent pools, ponds and shoreline areas of sylvan lakes to increase sunlight. The flora and fauna that live in these water bodies are very sensitive to temperature change, and being creatures of forest shade are typically very sensitive to sunlight as well. In a healthy ecosystem, their vulnerability to temperature and light does not tend to create a problem, because normally Acadian forest is very stable, typically recycled only slowly by wildfire, though sometimes by small eruptions of blights and pests here and there. In a natural and healthy Acadian ecosystem, it would take between 900 and 2,000 years for forest fires to entirely burn and recycle a forest. This very slow rate of loss leaves ample time for tree replacement, and thus, forest bodies of water are amply shaded and cooled, and their ecosystems are stable. By contrast, the forestry cartel clear-cuts forests at rates as high as 4%, and while that number might sound low, it is as much as 80 times faster than nature intended. However, it is fairly typical in Canada for forestry companies to underreport the rates by which they clear-cut and the results of their activities. So here are two articles for your perusal at your leisure, one covering an update on that underreporting, the other covering the devastating results of clear-cutting on biodiversity. Because the New Brunswick forestry industry harvests, let's just come out and say it, clear-cuts forests so much faster than nature can manage, forest bodies of water experience overexposure to sunlight, increasing temperature, and ultimately loss. Trees are organisms that can take decades and centuries to develop. Forests are superorganisms that take many centuries to reach maturity. They are such complex superorganisms that if they are destroyed, there is no guarantee what replaces them will in any way look like or be as healthy as what was there before. And rates of clear-cutting strip these forests somewhere between hundreds and thousands of % faster than nature intended or can sustain in natural circumstances. Which is, ultimately to say, that transforming a native forest into a tree farm and then clear-cutting it massively in no way resembles the work of forest fires. The differences between a clear-cut forest and a forest hit by fire or blight are not only visually, but also functionally quite evident. A clear-cut forest soil is severely damaged by heavy machines, and it is left gashed and vulnerable to erosion, where torn down trees and jagged stumps and brush and branches lie everywhere, making it nearly impossible for larger animals to move about, and leaving behind vast quantities of organic material which will inevitably rot and flow away with the rains, and the inevitable erosion, since clear-cut land does poorly at retaining water, will flow into watercourses, very possibly to provide too much nutrient to wild lakes and ponds, causing those ecosystems to suffer from eutrophication, a condition in which too much nutrient hits the waters, causing vast blooms of algae, which can render the water poisonous, and also triggers microorganism growth which can remove oxygen from water, killing fish and wildlife that visit those lakes and ponds. I know I was going to read his story all the way through without interruption, but this is so far from accurate that I have to pause and say that either Mike Legere is vastly ignorant of his own field, or he's just assuming his audience is incredibly stupid. Alright, well, back to the editorial. So, once again quoting, "In fact, it is naturally occurring forest regrowth that dominates 85% of our forested landscape. Unfortunately, the producer of this video has wrongly extrapolated his interpretation of this forest stand to all of New Brunswick, peppering his narrative with alarmist and inflammatory language like devastating and, my favorite, biblical level destruction. But I wouldn't build an ark just yet. The problem is not with the documenting of forestry operations. Forestry professionals and the companies that employ them are all for showing off what they do in forestry management. Forestry companies regularly invite critics to view their operations with a view of explaining what is popularly misunderstood as deforestation. Sometimes, to their credits, critics show up, most times not. Clearcutting, as a popular example, is in fact one type of harvesting practice used to regenerate even-aged conifer stands. It is a prevalent harvesting method owing to the abundance of mature softwood forests in New Brunswick. Of course, there are set-asides, 23%, soon to be 28%, of the 3 million hectares of Crown Forest area will be in conservation because an appropriate amount of old-growth forests, watercourse buffers, and other conservation needs are an important part of forest management. It is an oversight or calculated strategy that these budding documentarians do not report on the 30% hardwood forests that cover our province, or the 20% mixed wood forests, and the management techniques used to sustain this diverse mixture of forest composition. This is the all-important context that is absent from the 10-minute YouTube variety clip, carefully curated to select one type of forest stand managed for one type of outcome. There are many outcomes that critics do not want you to see, and definitely they do not want to acknowledge for fear of losing their audience. The story of a clear cut or any harvest type does not stop at the cut. There are important chapters that follow in the story of forest management. We simply ask of those recording the story, let the camera roll a little longer than 10 minutes because sometimes a picture is not worth 1,000 words. Mike Legere, Executive Director of Forest New Brunswick. It could be a compelling narrative if we discount the fact that just about every scientist, from biologist to ecologist on this planet, who is not employed by the forestry industry is gravely concerned about deforestation. It's even more interesting when one bears in mind that it was only last summer that the industrial voices of forestry in New Brunswick were harassing Professors Beckler and Noseworthy at the University of New Brunswick for writing an article expressing concern about the borealization of Acadian forests. These same voices were claiming that they had never heard of borealization before, yet they were experts in forestry. And yet, the concept of borealization is not new. It's been around quite literally for decades, and is a long-standing concern among environmental scientists and conservationists. I was taught the concept roughly around the year 2000 by my biology professor, and it had been around since some time before then. But while Mike Legere claims in this, what I loosely call an editorial, because it's really much more of a propaganda piece, that the forestry industry invites critique, the reality is, those persons who critique New Brunswick forestry very quickly fall under the ire of the powers that be. And if you're wondering just how concerned they are about controlling the narrative regarding New Brunswick forestry, note that they even felt it necessary to attack a small YouTube channel with 2,500 subscribers, run by a guy producing videos on his home computer. To me, anyway, it speaks something about how tightly Forest New Brunswick wants to control information. The story, the official story, is they're not causing deforestation. They're harvesting, the forest will grow back, and anything that looks like deforestation is simply misunderstood by all you rank amateurs. And it's really forest in transition that's going to grow back. Insofar as I can tell, in the mind of Mike Legere, deforestation does not exist. It's simply a matter of semantics. If you cut a forest, it's eventually going to regrow. If you cut away the native Acadian forest and replant a pulp plantation, no matter, it's still a forest. It would appear that a forest remains a forest even after it's clear-cut and its biodiversity is wrecked. Because as long as there is an intention to have trees grow there again, it must not be deforestation. Otherwise, I cannot understand how we might claim that deforestation really is not an issue, especially in light of the fact that climate scientists, environmental scientists, and scientists in the fields of biology are universally expressing grave concern over this situation. Well, in truth, I do understand their official narrative, the story they want the public to buy. According to that story, deforestation most definitely is not logging. At least not according to this very pro-forestry document produced by Canadian Forest Service Science Policy Notes. Note how it specifically says, deforestation is not logging. Deforestation only occurs when the forest is cleared to be used permanently for a non-forest use, such as agriculture or urban spread. Such a definition might fly if clear-cutting were not so widespread and rampant that forests were being destroyed far faster than they can regenerate, thus severely impacting their ecosystems, watersheds, and carbon sequestration. So, is a picture perhaps not worth 1,000 words because, even though you see a clear-cut, Forest NB knows one day that land is going to grow back to become a forest? What if the satellite imagery you observe portrays tens of thousands of hectares of cut-away forest, and a landscape that is more clear-cut than forest? What if the forest that's replanted isn't biodiverse, but more of a tree farm, not intended to support wildlife or maintain the land, just intended to make money for a certain industry? Is it then still a forest? Did the images lie? What I will tell you is this. Don't believe Mike Legere, and don't believe me. And certainly don't buy into my, as Mike described it, alarmist language that I use to get more YouTube subscribers. Just pop onto your computer and look up satellite imagery for yourself on Bing Maps or Google and see what's going on in your own backyard. And then take that a step further. Go out your door and pick a direction. If you live in the heart of one of the larger towns, you don't have to go but a few miles. If you live out in the country, you probably barely have to go a mile. Take a walk through the landscape. You won't have to go far to find the vast cuts and the tree farms that are apparently perfectly acceptable and not signs of deforestation. Don't trust me. Don't trust Mike Legere. Go out there and see for yourself. I challenge you to do so. Science is a process of discovery and testing the evidence. And anyone who is serious about it is devoted to the process of critical thinking. Test your resources and discover for yourself. I'm very confident the evidence is right out there just waiting to be seen. Will the trees of deforested land eventually grow back? Yes, most likely, unless the land is so utterly destroyed that the topsoil is ruined. But regrowing a forest, at least to the basic stages, the mature stages of growth, takes many decades. Regrowing an old biodiverse forest takes centuries. And if you're following the news on climate science and global loss of biodiversity, then you know we're at the tipping point and we really don't have centuries, much less decades. It's time to act with something greater than just the dollar in mind. It's time to act with the goal of making a better, greener world. We can do it if we act together, for our children and their children. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue. Please, after watching, take a moment to comment below. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.